This video is made for entertainment purposes only. I destroyed the most important scientific discovery in human history. Not because it was wrong. Not because I couldn't verify it. I destroyed it because it was right, and the truth was so devastating that I couldn't let it exist in this world. My name is Dr. Ethan Reeves. I was a geneticist. Past tense. For 15 years, I worked at the cutting edge of evolutionary biology at the Pacific Northwest Genomics Institute in Seattle. I published over 40 peer-reviewed papers. I consulted for the CDC, the NIH, and 3 pharmaceutical companies. I had tenure, respect, a corner office overlooking Puget Sound. And then, on a cold November morning in 2019, I received a package that ended all of that. Before I tell you about the sample, you need to understand who I was and what I believed. I was a rationalist, a skeptic. I'd spent my entire career dismantling pseudoscience, debunking miracle cures, and educating the public about genetic literacy. When people claimed they'd found ancient alien DNA or living dinosaur tissue, I was the guy who explained, patiently and publicly, why they were wrong. Cryptozoology, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the Yeti? I considered it all folklore. Entertaining, sure, culturally significant, even, but not real. Not scientifically viable. The Pacific Northwest is Bigfoot country. You can't live in Seattle without encountering the myth. Gift shops sell plush Sasquatch toys. Breweries name IPAs after him. Every few months, someone posts grainy footage online, always blurry, always inconclusive. I'd seen dozens of evidence samples over the years. Bear hair, elk scat, human hoaxes. Every single one had a mundane explanation. So when my lab assistant, Jenny, brought me a padded envelope marked urgent biological sample on that November morning, I wasn't expecting anything extraordinary. Another Bigfoot believer? I asked, not looking up from my microscope. Jenny shrugged. No return address. Postmarked from somewhere in the North Cascades. There's a note. She handed me a single sheet of paper, handwritten in tight, anxious script. Dr. Reeves, I've followed your work for years. You're a skeptic, that's why I'm sending this to you. I need someone who won't believe it. Someone who'll try to prove it wrong. I found this hair sample near Glacier Peak, Washington, in September. I'm not a scientist. I don't know what this is. But I know it's not human. And I know it's not any animal I've ever seen. Test it. Sequence it. Tell me I'm wrong. Please don't try to find me. If you publish your findings, don't mention my name. I'm not looking for fame. I'm looking for answers. A witness. The envelope contained a small plastic vial with 3 strands of coarse, dark hair. Each strand was roughly 6 inches long, thick as twine, with a distinctive reddish-brown tint near the root. I held the vial up to the light. Could be bear, Jenny said. Could be human, I replied. Probably is. But I was curious. Not because I believed it was anything unusual, but because I enjoyed the process of disproving these claims. It was good practice for my students. A teaching moment. All right, I said. Let's sequence it. We started with the basics. Microscopic analysis showed the hair had a medulla, a hollow core, which is common in animal hair but rare in human hair. The cuticle scale pattern was unusual, overlapping, like shingles on a roof, but irregular. Not quite human. Not quite ape. Not quite bear. Interesting, I muttered. Let's extract the DNA. Hair without a follicle is tough to sequence, but these samples had intact roots, perfect for genetic analysis. We extracted the DNA, prepped it for sequencing, and loaded it into our Illumina NovaSeq 6000. The machine would take about 48 hours to process the genome. I forgot about the sample. I had grants to write, lectures to prepare. It was just another curiosity. 2 days later, Jenny came into my office. Her face was pale. Dr. Reeves, she said quietly, you need to see this. I followed her to the sequencing lab. On the screen was the genomic readout, a digital map of the sample's DNA. At first glance, it looked normal. Eukaryotic. Mammalian. But as I scrolled through the data, my stomach tightened. "This can't be right," I whispered. Jenny nodded. "I ran it 3 times. Same result. The genome wasn't matching anything in our database. Not bear. Not ape. Not wolf, elk, or any known North American mammal. But it was matching something else. Homo sapiens. 99.9% of the DNA was identical to modern human DNA. I stared at the screen, my mind racing through explanations. Contamination. Lab error. A human hair mislabeled as cryptid evidence. It happened. It was the simplest explanation. "Run it again," I said. "New extraction. Clean workspace. Full contamination protocol." Jenny did. We reran the entire sequence from scratch. Same result. 99.9% human. But here's the thing. It wasn't entirely human. That 0.1% difference, that tiny genetic margin, was profoundly, disturbingly wrong. Let me explain. When we compare human DNA to chimpanzee DNA, we're about 98.8% identical. That 1.2% difference accounts for everything that makes us human. Language, abstract thought, bipedalism, culture. Neanderthals? 99.7% identical to us. Denisovans? Roughly the same. This sample was 99.9% human, closer to us than Neanderthals. But the differences weren't random mutations. They weren't junk DNA or benign variations. They were deactivations. Specific gene sequences, complex, functional sequences, that exist in modern humans but are dormant or suppressed in us, were active in this sample. I'll give you an example. There's a gene cluster called HAR1, part of the human accelerated regions, sections of DNA that changed rapidly during human evolution. In modern humans, HAR1 is associated with brain development. It's one of the reasons we have complex language and problem-solving abilities. In this sample, HAR1 was present, but it had additional active segments that are silenced in modern humans. The same was true for genes linked to muscle density, myostatin inhibitors that are inactive in humans, sensory perception, olfactory and auditory genes that we've partially lost, bone structure, increased skeletal robustness, denser connective tissue, metabolic efficiency, cold adaptation, fat storage regulation. It was as if someone had taken a modern human genome and turned back on genetic switches that had been flipped off thousands of years ago. "This doesn't make sense," Jenny said. "How can something be more human than human?" I didn't answer, because the answer forming in my mind was impossible. I spent the next week in isolation, running analysis after analysis. I cross-referenced the sample with every hominid genome in the global database: Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalensis, Homo denisova, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis. The sample didn't match any extinct species. It was too close to us. But it also wasn't a mutation. The genetic differences were too organized, too functional. They weren't random errors. They were features. And then I found something that made my hands shake. In the mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down through the maternal line, I traced the lineage back. The sample's mtDNA shared a common ancestor with modern humans. But the divergence point was wrong. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, emerged in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago. Our mtDNA lineages trace back to mitochondrial Eve, a woman who lived around 150,000 years ago. This sample's mtDNA diverged from the modern human line approximately 40,000 years ago. Not 300,000. Not 150,000. 40,000. Right around the time Homo sapiens was migrating out of Africa and into Europe, Asia, and North America. I sat back in my chair, my mind reeling. There was only one explanation that fit the data. This wasn't a primitive hominid. It wasn't an evolutionary dead end or a lost ancestor. This was a parallel branch of humanity. A lineage that split from Homo sapiens roughly 40,000 years ago, and survived. Not in Africa. Not in Europe. In North America. And here's the part that broke me. The genetic evidence suggested that they retained traits that we lost. The active gene sequences in this sample, muscle density, sensory acuity, metabolic adaptation, weren't mutations. They were ancestral traits. Traits that modern humans used to have, and then evolutionarily suppressed. We didn't evolve forward from them. We evolved away from them. We are the ones who changed. We are the ones who lost strength, lost sensory sharpness, lost cold adaptation. We traded those traits for something else. Fine motor skills, complex language, social cooperation, abstract thought. We became weaker, physically, but smarter, socially. And they, whoever they were, stayed strong. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my office, staring at the data, trying to process what it meant. If this was real, if this sample came from a living, breathing member of a parallel human lineage, then everything we thought we knew about human evolution was incomplete. Homo sapiens wasn't the only survivor. We weren't alone. Somewhere in the mountains of North America, there was a population of hominids, intelligent, bipedal, tool-using hominids, who had lived alongside us, hidden, for 40,000 years. Bigfoot wasn't a myth. Bigfoot was us. A version of us that took a different path. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the genetic signature of suppression. Those deactivated genes in modern humans? They didn't just turn off randomly. The patterns suggested selective pressure, evolutionary forces that favored humans who lost those traits. Why? Why would evolution favor humans who were physically weaker, less adapted to the wild? The answer, I realized, was chilling. Because we didn't need those traits anymore. We had technology. We had fire. We had weapons. We didn't need to be strong. We needed to be smart enough to create tools that made us strong. We didn't need sharp senses. We needed to be social enough to hunt in groups. We outcompeted every other hominid species, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus, not because we were better, but because we were ruthless. We cooperated in larger groups. We planned. We strategized. And we killed anything that competed with us. I stopped going to the lab. I told my colleagues I had the flu. I ignored emails, canceled lectures, let my phone ring unanswered. For 3 days, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the printed genome sequences spread across my kitchen table. I knew what I was supposed to do. Publish. Share the findings. Alert the scientific community. This was a discovery that would rewrite textbooks, reshape our understanding of human evolution, win a Nobel Prize. But every time I imagined releasing this information into the world, I felt sick, because I knew what would happen. First, there would be disbelief, skepticism, accusations of fraud or contamination. That part one could handle. I'd spent my career defending data against critics. But then, once the findings were verified, once other labs replicated the results, the circus would begin. Governments would get involved. Military agencies, corporations, conservationists and cryptozoologists and documentary crews and trophy hunters. Every forest in North America would be combed. Drones, infrared cameras, DNA traps. A manhunt disguised as scientific inquiry. And when they found them, when they finally cornered a living member of this species, what then? Would we treat them as human? Protect them under law? Or would we treat them as animals? Subjects for study, specimens for dissection? I thought about the history of contact between civilizations. Europeans and indigenous peoples. Colonizers and the colonized. It never ended well for the ones with less technology. And these people, whoever they were, whatever they called themselves, had remained hidden for 40,000 years. That wasn't luck. That was strategy. They knew what we were. They knew what we'd do if we found them. I poured myself a whiskey and stood at my window, looking out over the lights of Seattle. Somewhere out there, in the mountains and forests we thought we'd conquered, there was a parallel branch of humanity. Living quietly, invisibly. And I held their existence in a manila folder on my kitchen table. The anonymous note echoed in my mind, "Tell me I'm wrong." I couldn't. But I also couldn't just sit on this. Pretend I hadn't seen it. I needed to know more. I needed to understand what I was dealing with before I decided what to do with it. So I made a choice that, looking back, probably saved my sanity, and possibly saved their lives. I decided to find them myself. The postmark on the envelope said, North Cascades. That was a region of nearly 700,000 acres, jagged peaks, dense old-growth forest, glacial valleys. Some of the most remote wilderness in the continental United States. But the note had mentioned Glacier Peak, specifically. I pulled up topographic maps, overlaid them with reported Bigfoot sightings from the past 50 years. I wasn't looking for tourist photos or hoaxes. I was looking for clusters. Areas where multiple credible witnesses, hikers, forest rangers, hunters, reported encounters. There was a pattern. A stretch of wilderness between Glacier Peak and the Monte Cristo area, roughly 30 miles of unlogged forest. No roads. No trails. Just mountains, rivers, and trees that had been standing for 500 years. If I were a species trying to avoid humans, that's where I'd be. I told Jenny I was taking a personal leave. I didn't tell her why. I packed light, a tent, a sleeping bag, water filtration, enough freeze-dried food for 2 weeks. No GPS tracker. I didn't want anyone following my route. Just a compass, paper maps, and a satellite phone for emergencies. And one other thing, a small DNA sampling kit. Swabs, vials, sterile gloves. Just in case. I wasn't going to capture anything. I wasn't going to hurt anything. I just wanted proof. Irrefutable, physical proof that I could see with my own eyes. And maybe, I wanted to understand them before the rest of the world did. The hike took 3 days. I followed ridgelines, avoided trails, moved slowly through the underbrush. The forest was ancient and silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, makes you aware of every breath, every snapped twig. On the 4th day, I found the first sign. A footprint. It was in a muddy depression near a creek, half filled with water but still distinct. 17 inches long. Broad. 5 toes. Deep heel impression. I knelt beside it, my heart pounding. This wasn't a bear print. Bears have claws. This had a flat, flexible arch, like a human foot, but massive. I took photos from every angle. Measured it. Collected a soil sample from inside the print. Then I sat back on my heels and looked around. They were here. Over the next week, I found more. Not footprints, those were rare, only visible in soft ground. But other things. Things a trained observer would notice. Tree breaks. Branches snapped at a height of 8 to 10 feet, bent systematically in a pattern that didn't match. Wind damage or animal activity. Some researchers theorized these were territorial markers. Nests. Woven structures of branches and moss, tucked into dense thickets. Too large for bears. Too deliberate for random debris. Scat. I found feces near a riverbank, omnivorous, filled with berry seeds and bone fragments. I collected a sample. Later analysis would show gut bacteria consistent with a hominid digestive system. Gifting behavior. This one startled me. On the 6th day, I left a small pile of apples near my campsite as an experiment. The next morning, they were gone, but in their place was a neat stack of smooth river stones. Deliberate. Intentional. They knew I was here. And they were watching. I started talking out loud as I hiked. I'm not here to hurt you, I said to the empty forest. I'm a scientist. I'm trying to understand. I just want to know you exist. It felt absurd. Like praying to a god I wasn't sure was listening. But on the 8th day, something changed. I woke before dawn to a sound, a low, resonant vocalization. Not quite a howl. Not quite a voice. Something in between. It came from the ridgeline above my camp, echoing through the trees. I froze, barely breathing. The call repeated. Then, from farther away, an answer. A different tone. A conversation. I grabbed my recorder and captured 30 seconds of audio before the sounds faded. Later, I'd analyze the audio. The vocalizations had structure, pitch variation, rhythmic phrasing, linguistic markers. They weren't just making noise. They were talking. On the 10th day, I saw one. It was late afternoon. I was crossing a rocky slope above a glacial stream, moving carefully over loose scree. And then I looked up. 50 yards ahead, standing on a boulder at the edge of the tree line, was a figure. Tall, easily 8 feet. Broad-shouldered, covered in dark reddish-brown hair. The face was flat, more human than ape. The eyes were deep-set, intelligent. We stared at each other. I didn't move. Didn't reach for my camera. Didn't speak. I just looked. And it looked back. Its expression wasn't aggressive. It wasn't curious, exactly. It was assessing. The way you'd look at a stranger who'd wandered into your home. For maybe 20 seconds, we stood there. Two branches of humanity, separated by 40,000 years of evolution, seeing each other clearly for the first time. And then it turned and walked into the forest. Not hurried. Not frightened. Just done with me. I sat down hard on the rocks, my legs shaking. Holy God. They're real. They're real, and they're us. That face. Those eyes. I'd seen human intelligence looking back at me. Not animal cunning. Not instinct. Thought. I hiked back to Seattle in a daze. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. I went straight to the lab, locked myself in my office, and pulled up the genetic data again. Now, with the encounter fresh in my mind, I saw the sequences differently. The traits this species retained, strength, sensory acuity, environmental adaptation, weren't primitive. They were optimal for survival in the wild. We were the ones who changed. We were the ones who lost those advantages. And we did it because we didn't need them anymore. We built fires to stay warm, so we lost cold adaptation. We built weapons to hunt, so we lost muscle density. We built societies to protect us, so we lost the hyper-awareness needed to survive alone. We became weaker, physically, because our intelligence compensated. But here's the kicker. That trade-off came at a cost. Modern humans are born helpless. Our infants can't cling to us, can't walk, can't survive without years of intensive care. Our bodies are fragile. Our senses are dull. We're adapted to civilized life, not wild life. We're domesticated. And the Sasquatch, the Sask, as I started thinking of them, weren't. They were what we used to be before we domesticated ourselves. They were the wild version of humanity. But the genetic data told me something else. Something darker. The divergence point, 40,000 years ago, coincided with a major event in human history. The arrival of Homo sapiens in North America. The archaeological consensus is that humans crossed the Bering Land Bridge around 15,000 to 20,000 years ago. But there's growing evidence of much earlier migrations, possibly as far back as 30,000 to 40,000 years ago. What if the Sask were already here? What if they were an earlier wave of hominids, an offshoot of Homo sapiens that migrated to North America during the Ice Age, then adapted to the environment while the rest of humanity kept moving? And what if, when modern Homo sapiens arrived later, we did what we always do? We competed. We killed. We drove them out. Just like we did to the Neanderthals in Europe. Just like we did to the Denisovans in Asia. Just like we've done to every other hominid species we've ever encountered. I thought about the anonymous note, "Tell me I'm wrong." I couldn't. Because the genetic data, the evidence, the encounter, it all pointed to the same conclusion. The Sasquatch weren't monsters. They weren't animals. They were people. A people we'd been hunting for 40,000 years. I printed out the entire genomic analysis. Every chart, every sequence, every comparison. I put it all in a folder. And then I sat at my desk with a lighter in my hand. If I published this, I'd be famous. Respected. Vindicated. But they'd be doomed. Once the world knew they existed, there'd be no stopping the flood. Researchers, hunters, governments, corporations. Forests bulldozed to flush them out. Drones tracking their movements. Capture teams with tranquilizer guns. And eventually, someone would kill one. For study. For proof. For a trophy. It's what we do. It's what we've always done. I thought about that figure on the boulder. The intelligence in those eyes. The deliberate choice to walk away instead of attack. They'd had 40,000 years to wipe us out, and they hadn't. They'd hidden instead. They'd chosen coexistence over conquest. And now I held their fate in my hands. I flicked the lighter. The flame caught the edge of the paper. The data curled and blackened. Gene sequences turned to ash. I fed every page into the fire. Printouts, notes, analysis. I deleted the digital files. Wiped the backup drives. Destroyed the hair samples. I erased the most important scientific discovery in human history. And then I walked out of the lab, drove home, and wrote a single email. To the witness who sent the sample. You were right. I tested it. I know what it is. And I'm telling you, you're wrong to want answers. Some truths are too dangerous to know. Let them be. Dr. Ethan Reeves. I resigned from the Pacific Northwest Genomics Institute 3 weeks later. I didn't give a real reason. I told the dean I was burned out, that I needed time away from academia, that I wanted to pursue private consulting. All technically true. All fundamentally lies. Jenny cornered me on my last day. What happened? She asked. Was it the sample? Did you find something? I looked at her, this brilliant young scientist with her whole career ahead of her, and I lied to her face. Contamination, I said. Human DNA. The whole thing was a waste of time. She frowned. But we ran it 3 times. Doesn't matter. It's done. Let it go. I could see the doubt in her eyes. She didn't believe me. But she didn't push. I walked out of the building, turned in my keycard, and never went back. The first year was the hardest. I moved out of Seattle. Too many memories. Too many colleagues asking questions. I bought a small cabin outside of Olympia, Washington, close enough to the mountains to feel connected to what I'd seen, far enough from civilization to avoid scrutiny. I took consulting jobs remotely. Genetic analysis for agricultural companies, DNA testing for paternity cases. Work that paid the bills but didn't require passion. At night, I drank. Not to forget. I couldn't forget, even if I wanted to. But to numb the weight of what I knew. I'd destroyed evidence of a living hominid species. I'd violated every principle of scientific inquiry. I'd chosen suppression over truth. And I couldn't tell anyone why. Friends stopped calling. Colleagues assumed I'd had a breakdown. My ex-wife, we divorced 2 years before the sample arrived, sent a concerned email asking if I was okay. I didn't reply. How could I explain? I met a parallel branch of humanity, and I chose to let them stay hidden because I don't trust our species to do the right thing. I'd sound insane. Maybe I was. But here's the thing. I didn't regret it. Every time I doubted myself, I'd open my laptop and search the news for stories about endangered species. Gorillas poached for bushmeat. Elephants slaughtered for ivory. Tigers driven to near extinction for traditional medicine. And those were species we acknowledged as endangered. Species we'd built sanctuaries and laws to protect. It didn't matter. Humans killed them anyway. Now imagine what we'd do to a species that looked like us, walked like us, thought like us, but wasn't us. We'd debate their rights while we hunted them. We'd pass laws while we dissected them. We'd build museums in their honor while we drove them to extinction. No. Better they stay hidden. Better they survive in the margins, in the forgotten corners of the wilderness, than be discovered and destroyed by our good intentions. 5 years passed. I lived simply. I worked enough to pay bills. I hiked often, never back to Glacier Peak, but to other wild places. The Olympics. The Gifford Pinchot. places where the forest was old and deep and untouched. I never saw another one. But sometimes, on those hikes, I'd find signs. A tree break. A footprint in soft mud. A stack of stones where no human had reason to be. And I'd smile. You're still here. Good. In 2024, 5 years after I burned the data, I got an email. The sender was anonymous, routed through an encrypted service. The subject line was blank. The message read, Dr. Reeves. I was the one who sent you the sample in 2019. I never heard back from you. I assumed you thought I was crazy, or that the sample was nothing. But last month, I went back to Glacier Peak. To the same place I found the hair. And I saw one. A female, I think. She was with a juvenile. Maybe her child. They were gathering plants near a stream. The juvenile was playing, stacking rocks, splashing in the water. The adult was watching, patient, protective. I didn't approach. I just watched. And then the adult looked at me. Not startled. Not afraid. Just aware. She made a sound, low, rumbling. The juvenile stopped playing and moved closer to her. And then they walked away. Slowly. Deliberately. I don't know why I'm telling you this. Maybe because you're the only other person who might understand. They're not animals, Dr. Reeves. They're people. And I think they've been letting us see them. Just enough to remind us they're here. Just enough to warn us to stay away. I won't send you another sample. I won't tell anyone what I saw. I just wanted you to know, you were right to stay silent. A witness. I read the email 3 times. Then I closed my laptop, put on my coat, and walked into the woods behind my cabin. I didn't cry often. But that night, standing under the trees in the cold November air, I wept. Not from sadness. From relief. They were still there. Still hidden. Still surviving. And someone else, someone who'd seen them with their own eyes, understood why silence was mercy. I've spent the last year thinking about what it all means. Not the science. I understand the science. The genetics, the evolution, the divergence. That part is clear. What I don't understand is us. Why do we destroy everything we touch? It's not malice. I don't think humans are inherently evil. But we're efficient. We're adaptable. We outcompete every other species because we're willing to do whatever it takes to survive. And once we don't need something, once it's no longer useful to us, we discard it. We did it to the Neanderthals. They were stronger, better adapted to the cold. But we were smarter, more social. We bred with them, absorbed their genes, and replaced them. We did it to the megafauna, woolly mammoths, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats. We hunted them to extinction not because we hated them, but because we could. We did it to indigenous peoples across the globe. We colonized, displaced, erased entire cultures, not out of cruelty, but out of inevitability. We don't conquer because we're monsters. We conquer because we're human. And that's what terrifies me about the Sask. If the world knew they existed, we'd mean well. We'd pass laws to protect them. We'd create reserves, fund research, build documentaries celebrating their existence. But we'd also study them, catalog them, track them, control them. We'd take away the one thing that's kept them alive for 40,000 years. Their invisibility. And once we could see them, once we could count them, we'd realize how few there are. Maybe a few hundred, maybe less. And then we'd panic. We'd declare them endangered. We'd try to save them. We'd capture them for breeding programs. We'd take blood samples, tissue biopsies. We'd put them in enclosures for their own protection. We'd love them to death. The Sask survived because they stayed hidden, because they watched us from the shadows and learned what we are. They learned that we're the apex predator, not because we're the strongest or the fastest, but because we're the most relentless. And they chose to avoid us, not out of fear. Out of wisdom. 2 months ago, I went back to Glacier Peak. I didn't plan to. But it was the 10th anniversary of the sample's arrival, and I felt pulled. Like I needed to see the place again. To pay my respects. I hiked the same route I'd taken years before. The forest had changed. Some trees had fallen, new growth had filled in the gaps, but the bones of the landscape were the same. On the third day, I made camp near the creek where I'd seen the footprint a decade ago. That night, I built a small fire and sat staring into the flames. I kept my promise, I said to the darkness. I didn't tell them. I never will. The forest was silent. And then, from somewhere in the trees behind me, I heard it. A low, resonant call. The same vocalization I'd recorded 10 years ago. I froze. The call repeated. Closer this time. I turned slowly. At the edge of the firelight, just beyond the reach of the flames, stood a figure. Tall, broad, covered in dark hair, streaked with gray. It was the same one. I was sure of it. The same individual I'd seen on the boulder all those years ago. Older now. Weathered. We looked at each other across the fire. And then it did something that broke me. It raised one hand, massive, long-fingered, and pressed it to its chest. A gesture. Me. Then it extended the hand toward me. You. It wasn't random. It wasn't instinct. It was communication. Acknowledgement. I couldn't speak. I could barely breathe. Slowly, carefully, I raised my own hand and pressed it to my chest. Me. Then I extended it toward the figure. You. For a long moment, we stood there. Two representatives of two humanities. Separated by evolution but connected by something deeper. Recognition. And then the figure turned and walked back into the forest. I didn't follow. I just sat by the fire, tears streaming down my face, and whispered, "Thank you." I'm writing this now, 10 years after I received the sample, 2 months after the final encounter, because I need to put it into words. Not to publish. Not to share. Just to remember. Because someday, someone else will find evidence. Someone else will sequence DNA, analyze footprints, record vocalizations. And they'll face the same choice I did. Truth or mercy. Discovery or protection. I chose mercy. I chose to let them remain a myth. A legend. A story told around campfires and dismissed by skeptics. Because myths can't be hunted. Myths can't be captured. Myths can survive. Here's what I know. The Sasquatch, the Sask, the wild humans, whatever name we give them, are real. They're not animals. They're not monsters. They're us. A version of us that chose a different path 40,000 years ago. They chose the forest. We chose the city. They chose strength. We chose tools. They chose silence. We chose speech. And both choices were valid. Both paths were human. But here's the truth that haunts me. The genetic data showed that we are the mutation. We are the ones who changed. We lost the traits that made us strong, resilient, adapted to the wild. We traded them for intelligence, for culture, for civilization. And we told ourselves it was progress. But what if it wasn't? What if we didn't evolve forward? We just evolved differently. What if the Sask are what humans were supposed to be, and we're the broken version? The domesticated version. The version that can't survive without technology, without fire, without each other. I don't have an answer. But I know this. The Sask have survived for 40,000 years without destroying their environment. Without driving other species to extinction. Without war, pollution, or climate collapse. They lived in balance. And we, Homo sapiens, the wise man, have spent 10,000 years tearing the world apart. So who's really the advanced species? Who's really the success story? I'm not saying we should go back to the Stone Age. I'm not romanticizing wilderness or rejecting modernity. But I am saying this. We are not the pinnacle of evolution. We are not the only way to be human. And maybe, the Sask are here to remind us of that. To show us that there's another way. A quieter way. A way that doesn't require dominance or conquest or endless growth. A way that survives by staying small, by staying hidden, by letting the world be. I destroyed the most important scientific discovery in human history. And I'd do it again. Because some truths are too dangerous to know. Some species are too precious to expose. And some silences are more powerful than any words. The Sask are out there. In the mountains. In the deep forests. In the places we've forgotten or ignored. They're watching us. And I think they're waiting. Waiting to see if we'll learn. If we'll change. If we'll stop destroying everything we touch. Waiting to see if we'll prove that we deserve to share this world with them. I won't live to see that day. Maybe no one will. But I'll carry this secret to my grave. And when I die, the knowledge will die with me. The data is gone. The evidence is destroyed. The truth is buried. And somewhere in the mountains, a mother will teach her child to stack stones by a stream. A family will gather in the twilight and call to each other across the ridges. A people will survive. Hidden. Safe. Free. And that is worth more than all the fame, all the recognition, all the scientific glory in the world. Because I didn't just destroy data. I chose mercy over truth. I chose their survival over my legacy. I chose to let them be. And if that makes me a failure as a scientist, then I'll die a failure. But I'll die knowing I did the one thing that mattered. I let them live. Some discoveries are meant to stay hidden. Some truths are meant to stay secret. Some species are meant to remain a mystery. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly how it should be.